Rachel Carter had never been a fan of late shifts, but they were part of the job. Aerospace engineering wasn't exactly a 9-to-5 gig, and tonight was no exception. The hum of the city had faded to a dull murmur as she left the facility, pulling her jacket tighter against the cool night air. Her old motorcycle was parked a block away, right where she left it, and she exhaled, relieved that she was finally heading home. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional distant siren or the rustle of wind through abandoned alleyways. It was the kind of stillness that made her hyper-aware of her surroundings, a habit from her military days that never quite left her. Her footsteps echoed softly as she crossed an empty intersection. That's when the light hit. At first, she thought it was just a street lamp flickering, but then it grew, intensely bright, unnaturally silent. Before she could react, the world seemed to tilt, gravity shifting in a way that made her stomach churn. She felt her feet leave the ground. A sharp, metallic scent filled her nose. Her heart slammed against her ribs. And then, nothing. Rachel awoke to the distinct sensation of cold metal against her back. The air was thick, tinged with something sterile and foreign. Her instincts kicked in before full consciousness did, her body tensing, ready for action. When her vision cleared, she realized she was lying inside some kind of containment cell. The walls were sleek, metallic, and curved in a way that suggested advanced engineering, too smooth, too precise for anything human-made. She tried to move, only to find her wrists restrained by a force field-like bind that pulsed faintly when she strained against it. A low, guttural voice rumbled somewhere outside her cell. Rachel turned her head, her sharp eyes locking onto the figures watching her through a translucent barrier. They were massive. 7 feet tall at least, covered in dark, segmented armor. Their faces were reptilian, ridged and scarred, with piercing yellow eyes. One of them leaned closer, inspecting her like some kind of exotic specimen. Rachel gritted her teeth. If they were expecting her to panic, they were about to be disappointed. The reptilian figure grunted something in its native tongue, but before Rachel could decipher any meaning, it made a mistake. It got too close. Without hesitation, she launched her legs upward in a brutal, controlled kick. The impact was solid, her boot connecting with what she hoped was its jaw. The alien staggered back with a hiss, slamming into the metallic wall. The others tensed, their weapons shifting. One of them reached for a panel on its forearm, and a holographic interface flared to life. Rachel watched as they scanned something, a data file, an identification record. The moment it appeared, the energy in the room shifted. The gruffness, the arrogance, they vanished. One of the mercenaries took a step back. Another let out a hissing sound that could have been a curse. The one she kicked was too busy nursing its face to react, but even it seemed uneasy now. Rachel narrowed her eyes. She was missing something. Then the doors hissed open, and another figure entered. This one was different. His armor was more ornate, marked with deep grooves and insignias. His face was older, lined with battle scars, and he carried himself like someone used to giving orders. This was the leader. The way the others straightened confirmed it. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied her with an almost amused expression, arms crossed. Then, in perfect English, he said, "So, you are her?" Rachel's fingers twitched. Something in his tone wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. That didn't make sense. The leader tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking to the now active holographic screen. Her name was there. But it wasn't just her name. It was her call sign. A single word. Hellcat. Rachel's breath stilled. That name belonged to her military days, a time she had left behind. It was just a call sign, nothing more, a nickname given for her reckless flying and sharp combat instincts. But judging by the way these mercenaries were looking at her, that name meant something very different out here. The leader smirked. "Unbind her," he ordered. The others hesitated. One even let out a choked protest, but the leader shot them a sharp look, and just like that, the restraints deactivated. Rachel felt her muscles loosen, but she didn't move yet, keeping her expression unreadable. This was a shift in power. She didn't know why, but she wasn't about to waste it. She flexed her wrists, stepping forward. The mercenaries took another step back. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. Of all the people to be given this contract, we get the Hellcat. His tone was one of disbelief, but also something else, wary amusement. Rachel kept her stance firm. Funny. I don't recall signing up for whatever this is. The leader's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. No, he admitted. You wouldn't have. His golden eyes flicked back to the screen, where her call sign was still glowing. But there are some names you don't take lightly in this galaxy. And yours, well, let's just say it carries weight. Rachel kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. She had no idea what he was talking about. But if her name meant something to these aliens, if Hellcat was more than just a relic of her past, then she had a very, very useful advantage. And Rachel Carter never wasted an advantage. Rachel stared at the screen, her call sign glowing in an alien script she couldn't read but somehow understood. The mercenaries still hadn't moved, their uneasy glances shifting between her and their leader. The tension in the room was thick, pressing against her like a storm front. She had been in plenty of high-pressure situations before, but never had she seen people, aliens, so visibly shaken at the mention of her name. That alone told her everything she needed to know. Whatever they thought she was, it was something dangerous. The leader leaned against the console, arms crossed, his amusement thinly veiling something more calculating. Hellcat, he mused, almost like he was tasting the word. You don't even know, do you? Rachel didn't take the bait. Why don't you enlighten me? He exhaled through his nose, the alien equivalent of a chuckle. You disappeared years ago, after that little incident. And yet your name still lingers in hushed conversations, in mercenary halls, in the nightmares of a certain warlord. His golden eyes flicked up to meet hers. You have no idea what you did, do you? She didn't flinch, but she was already calculating. Incident. Warlord. None of that lined up with anything she remembered. The only thing that even remotely came close was a test flight gone wrong, a malfunction that had flung her further into deep space than anyone expected. She had barely made it back to Earth, and the mission had been classified before she could ask too many questions. That was years ago. You tell me, she said smoothly. The leader glanced at his crew, then back at her. You entered a restricted zone. A war zone. A battlefield between factions far beyond your understanding. And you did what no one had done before. He tilted his head. You humiliated him. Rachel's brow furrowed. Him who? A beat of silence. Then he said the name, and the entire room seemed to shrink. Vorac the Unyielding. She didn't recognize it. But judging by the way even the most battle-hardened mercenaries in the room looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, she had a feeling she should have. The leader studied her face, as if waiting for recognition. When none came, he let out another quiet chuckle. You outmaneuvered him. Made his fleet look like fools. He lost everything that day, his respect, his fleet, his standing. He's been searching for you ever since. Rachel folded her arms, playing along. And yet you're the ones who grabbed me. The leader's amusement faded slightly. We weren't looking for you. We were fulfilling a contract. Had we known, we never would have taken the job. Rachel's mind was working double time. If what he said was true, if she had unknowingly wrecked the career of some alien warlord, then she had power here. They weren't keeping her because they wanted to. They were afraid of the fallout. That was something she could use. She took a slow step forward. No one stopped her. Who hired you? The leader hesitated, and she could see the wheels turning behind his sharp, reptilian eyes. He didn't want to say. Which meant it was something big. She tilted her head. If you don't tell me, I'm going to assume it was him. She let the implication hang. If Vorac was as terrifying as they made him sound, the mercenaries wouldn't want to be mistaken for working for him. Sure enough, the leader's jaw tightened. No, he admitted. Not him. Rachel arched a brow. Then who? He exhaled sharply, like he was making a decision he already regretted. A human! That threw her for a loop. She had been expecting some high-ranking alien, maybe a bounty hunter, but a human? The leader continued, his voice edged with something like frustration. General Whitaker. Rachel's stomach dropped. That name, she did recognize. General Whitaker was one of the highest-ranking officials in the Earth Defense Command. She had worked under him during her military career, even respected him at one point. But if he was involved in hiring alien mercenaries to abduct her, then something was very, very wrong. Rachel kept her expression neutral. Why? The leader shrugged, but there was something tight in his posture. Didn't ask? Didn't care. A job's a job. His eyes flicked to the glowing call sign on the screen. Until now. She nodded slowly, putting the pieces together. Whitaker had ordered her taken, likely to get rid of her before she figured out whatever it was he was hiding. The mercenaries had picked her up, not realizing they had grabbed the wrong kind of trouble. Which meant she had leverage. You're letting me go, she said. The leader let out a slow breath. It's not that simple. It is for me, she countered. You keep me, you've got two problems, the general and Vorac. You let me walk, you've only got one. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The logic was solid, and they knew it. The leader sighed, rubbing his temples. You are exceedingly difficult, human. Rachel smirked. So I've been told. A long pause. Then, reluctantly, the leader gave the order. Take her back to the surface. The crew didn't argue. Within minutes, Rachel found herself escorted back through the sleek, alien corridors, her mind racing with possibilities. She had been abducted. She had learned she was feared. And now she had a name, a target. General Whitaker had made a mistake. She was going to make him regret it. Rachel sat in the cold, metallic seat of the transport pod, arms crossed as two mercenaries flanked her on either side. The ship hummed around them, the dull vibration of its engines a reminder that she was still very much at their mercy, for now. She had no weapons, no comms, and no immediate way to contact anyone on Earth. But she had something better. Leverage. The leader had made the right call in letting her go, but she wasn't naive. These were noble warriors. They were mercenaries. If circumstances shifted, so would their loyalties. Right now, fear worked in her favor, but fear could turn into desperation in an instant. The transport rumbled as it adjusted course. She had expected a direct drop-off, but the pilots suddenly barked something in their guttural language, and the tone in the cabin shifted. One of her guards tensed. The other swore under his breath. Rachel's gut told her exactly what this meant. Something was coming. The pilot turned, shouting something to the guards, and the one to her left snapped back in clear frustration. Rachel didn't need a translator to know the gist of it. Problem? She asked casually, leaning back. The mercenary snarled at her before answering. Incoming ship. Her pulse quickened. Let me guess. Big? Ugly? Pissed off? The other mercenary muttered a phrase that, judging by the pilot's immediate flinch, was something along the lines of "we're screwed." Rachel's smirk faded. Vorac. The ship rocked as the first warning shots fired. The mercenaries were suddenly in motion, barking orders, strapping into their harnesses, readying for a fight. Rachel stayed put, waiting, watching. The way they moved told her everything. This wasn't a battle they expected to win. The leader's voice crackled through the comms. Hellcat, you're going to want to listen very carefully. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Oh? We on nickname terms now? This isn't the time for your games, he snapped. Vorac found us faster than expected. We can't outrun him, and we definitely can't outgun him. A pause. But you can outfly him. That got her attention. You want me in the pilot's seat? You have a better option? Rachel grinned, unstrapping herself. You're lucky I don't hold grudges. The moment she stepped onto the bridge, she felt it, the weight of dozens of alien eyes on her. Some looked terrified. Others looked skeptical. None of them expected this to work. She cracked her knuckles and dropped into the pilot's chair. It was sleeker than she was used to, the controls unfamiliar, the screens covered in unreadable alien script. But flying was flying. The language didn't matter. Vorzac's ship was gaining fast. It was massive, twice the size of their vessel, bristling with weapons that looked like they could turn planets into dust. A transmission came through, and though Rachel couldn't understand the alien language, the fury in the voice was unmistakable. Vorac knew who she was. And he wanted blood. Rachel exhaled slowly, fingers curling around the controls. "All right, big guy. Let's see if you can keep up." She threw the ship into a sudden, gut-wrenching dive, spinning through the void as enemy fire streaked past. The mercenaries shouted in alarm as the artificial gravity struggled to compensate, but Rachel wasn't listening. She was in her element now. She banked hard, using the planet's gravitational pull to slingshot them forward. Vorzac's fleet adjusted, but not fast enough. "Status on their targeting?" she barked. One of the mercenaries fumbled at the controls. "Locked on us." Rachel grinned. "Let's fix that." She twisted the ship into a tight roll, pushing the engines to their limit. Their own shields flared as a few shots clipped the hull, but she was already anticipating their next move. She cut power abruptly, throwing the ship into a sudden stall that sent Vorzac's lead fighters shooting past them. The mercenaries yelped in panic. Rachel calmly flipped the engines back on and gunned it in the opposite direction. She could hear the leader over the comms, a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest maneuver I've ever seen." Rachel smirked. "I get that a lot." Vorzac's ship roared past, his main cannons overshooting by miles. She had bought them just enough time. Rachel turned sharply, making a beeline for the nearest asteroid cluster. The mercenary on weapons looked at her in alarm. "You're flying toward the rocks?" "Relax," she said, tilting the ship just enough to squeeze through the first gap. "I know what I'm doing." What followed was a high-speed chase through the asteroid field, Vorzac's fleet struggling to match her precision. They were built for brute force, not agility. And that was their downfall. Rachel wove between massive chunks of rock, the ship humming beneath her fingertips. She could feel it now, the rhythm of the flight, the pulse of the chase. It was like slipping back into a perfectly broken-in jacket. The moment came fast. Vorzac's lead ship fired a desperation shot just as Rachel spun the vessel sideways, skimming the surface of an asteroid so closely that the hull practically kissed the rock. Vorac wasn't so lucky. The shot he fired ricocheted off the asteroid and slammed straight into one of his own ships. A second later, an explosion rocked the void. Rachel let out a low whistle. "Oops." The mercenaries sat in stunned silence. Then, the leader's voice crackled through the comms. "I am never playing cards with you." Rachel grinned as she pulled them out of the asteroid field, Vorzac's fleet now a fading speck in the distance. She had just done the impossible. Again. And something told her the warlord would really hate that. Rachel sat in the mercenary ship's war room, her fingers drumming against the metal table as she studied the data scrolling across the screen. The name General Whitaker glowed in stark contrast against the alien interface. The leader of the mercenary crew stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her reaction carefully. "This is everything?" she asked, her voice neutral. He gave a slow nod. "It's what we were given. Payment records, encrypted messages, some sensitive communications between your general and certain off-world buyers." His reptilian eyes narrowed slightly. "Whatever he's involved in, it's big." Rachel's jaw tightened. The files told a story she didn't want to believe but couldn't ignore. Whitaker wasn't just another corrupt official. He was selling Earth's technology, high-grade, classified military tech, to alien factions in exchange for power. And worse, he had ties to factions even the mercenaries wouldn't name. Her gut twisted. She had trusted this man once. Served under him. And he had put a target on her back the moment she got too close to the truth. The mercenary captain watched her in silence before speaking again. "What do you plan to do with this information?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She was already running through her options. She could take the data public, but Whitaker had influence. He'd find a way to spin it, discredit her. No, she needed to be smart. She needed leverage, allies, someone with enough firepower to back her up. And she knew exactly who to call. She turned to the mercenary leader with a smirk. Ever hear of Colonel James Vance? His brow furrowed. Should I have? Rachel leaned back in her chair. Former Earth Defense Command. Led some of the most classified ops in deep space. Now runs a private security force that specializes in handling problems. She tapped the screen. He'll be very interested in this. The captain studied her for a moment, then let out a slow chuckle. You are full of surprises, Hellcat. She grinned. You have no idea. The transmission took only a few minutes to set up, but the wait felt longer. Finally, the screen flickered, and a familiar face appeared. Colonel James Vance hadn't changed much. The same sharp, no-nonsense eyes. The same iron jawline. But there was a weariness to him now, a man who had seen too much and carried it with him. Carter, he said, leaning forward. Wasn't expecting to hear from you. Yeah, well, she said, tilting her head. Didn't expect to be abducted by aliens this week, but here we are. His lips twitched. Sounds like a story. Oh, you'll love it. She tapped a button, sending the files through. But first, you're going to want to take a look at this. Vance's eyes flicked over the data as it loaded. His expression, at first unreadable, darkened as he scrolled through the evidence. When he finally looked up, his voice was quieter. Tell me this isn't real. Rachel exhaled. I wish I could. There was silence on the line. Then Vance leaned back, rubbing his chin. This is bad, he muttered. Worse than I thought. Rachel arched a brow. You knew? I had suspicions, he admitted. But nothing concrete. Not until now. His gaze sharpened. Do you have a plan? Rachel smirked. Always. Whitaker was careful. He wouldn't go down easy. But he had one fatal flaw, his arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he could operate in the shadows forever. She was about to drag him into the light. Vance nodded. All right, Carter. I'll back your play. Just tell me where and when. Rachel tapped her fingers against the table, considering. Then she grinned. Let's pay the general a visit. The meeting was arranged within hours. Whitaker thought he was walking into a private negotiation with an off-world buyer. Instead, he stepped into a trap. The room was high-end, polished, one of those discreet locations used for unofficial government dealings. Whitaker entered with his usual air of confidence, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. But the moment he saw Rachel sitting casually at the table, his entire body stiffened. Carter, he said slowly, his eyes darting around the room. You're supposed to be missing? She finished for him. Dead? In an alien prison somewhere? She leaned forward. Yeah. About that. Whitaker's expression barely flickered, but she could see the wheels turning behind his gaze. He was already calculating how to spin this, how to regain control of the situation. Rachel smirked. You look like a man with a lot on his mind. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small device and placing it on the table. Let me make it simple for you. With a tap, the hollow screen flared to life. The files appeared in crisp detail: communications, payment logs, incriminating messages. Whitaker's betrayal laid bare. His face didn't change. He was good at this, too good. These are fabricated. Rachel chuckled. Nice try. But I've got confirmation from multiple sources. She tilted her head. Including some very pissed-off aliens who aren't thrilled about being dragged into your mess. Whitaker exhaled slowly, as if weighing his next move. Then, to her mild surprise, he smirked. You think this is enough? He said. You think you've won? Rachel raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure. You don't understand how deep this goes, he said, his voice low. I'm not the only one playing this game. You expose me, And they will come for you. Rachel leaned in, her grin widening. Good. The doors burst open before Whitaker could respond. Vance stepped in, flanked by armed operatives. General Whitaker, Vance said coolly. You're under arrest. Whitaker's jaw clenched, but he didn't resist as they moved in. He simply stared at Rachel as if memorizing her face. This isn't over, he said. Rachel gave him a lazy salute. Oh, I hope not. I was just starting to have fun. As they dragged him out, Vance turned to her. Well, he said. That was satisfying. Rachel smirked. Told you. Vance studied her for a moment, then exhaled. So, what's next for you? Rachel glanced at the mercenaries in the corner of the room. Oh, I've got a few ideas. Rachel stood at the edge of the landing platform, the vast city stretching out beneath her. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of engines and city life below. It had been less than 24 hours since Whitaker had been taken into custody, but the weight of the moment hadn't fully sunk in. She should have felt relieved. The man who had tried to have her abducted, who had sold out Earth for his own gain, was finally facing justice. And yet, something inside her itched. The mercenary leader stepped up beside her, arms crossed. You don't seem like someone who just won. Rachel let out a slow breath. That's because I didn't. He gave her a questioning look, but she wasn't sure how to explain it. Maybe it was the way Whitaker had smirked at her, even in cuffs. Or maybe it was the fact that if he was willing to sell out Earth's military secrets, there were probably others like him, bigger players, deeper conspiracies. One battle down. 100 more waiting. The mercenary leader finally spoke. You could come with us. Rachel glanced at him. Oh? And do what? Join a band of overgrown lizards who get in over their heads? He smirked. You'd fit right in. She chuckled but didn't respond. The truth was, she had been considering it. Earth felt small now. She had spent her whole life believing the sky was the limit, but now she knew better. The real action was out there. She had a reputation, whether she wanted it or not. The Hellcat. A name that sent mercenaries and warlords into a panic. A name that made people hesitate before crossing her. There was power in that. And she had always known how to use power to her advantage. The mercenary leader watched her carefully, then said, We make good money. Rachel laughed. Yeah? What's the retirement plan look like? His smirk widened. Retirement? Never heard of it. She exhaled, looking back at the city. The safe choice would be to go back to her old life. Use her expertise, work on ships, maybe even disappear entirely. She had enough dirt on powerful people to buy herself a quiet existence. But that wasn't who she was. She was a pilot, a fighter, a survivor. And Earth wasn't big enough for her anymore. She turned back to the mercenary leader. All right, she said, stretching her arms. I'll bite. What's the job? His grin was sharp. We'll start small. Smuggling operation got a little complicated. Cargo's valuable, but the sector's crawling with patrols. We need someone who can get in and out without setting off alarms. Rachel arched a brow. Cargo? Let's just say it's not technically illegal, he said vaguely. She shook her head, amused. You're terrible at sales pitches. Maybe, he admitted. But you're already considering it. She hated that he was right. Rachel ran a hand through her hair, exhaling. She had spent her whole life following orders, playing by the rules. Even when she had pushed limits, she had always been tethered to something: Earth, her past, her duty. But now, no strings. No orders. Just the open stars. She looked at the ship waiting on the platform, a sleek, modified craft built for speed. Her fingers twitched. All right, she finally said. Let's see what this bucket of bolts can do. The mercenary leader grinned, stepping aside as she climbed aboard. The cockpit was different from what she was used to, alien controls, unfamiliar readings, but the moment she settled into the seat, it didn't matter. She wrapped her fingers around the throttle. Took a deep breath. and grinned. The Hellcat was back in the sky. And this time, she wasn't coming back down.